these are often really critical errors that we're talking with. Like, otherwise you wouldn't care to capture for errors unless something critical could happen, right? So I feel like the whole premise here is like, fail loudly. Like, how do we make it so that it's really clear that something bad happened and we need to take a different route at this point? That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, failing silently is always bad.
So I think of something, John, you often say, which is when you fail early and fail loudly.
Well, I think we're talking about error capturing and logging and tracking this morning. I know when I think about error capture in FileMaker, my brain goes to kind of a simple example of where I know I use error capturing all the time. That's the simple example of turning error capture on and doing a find and then turning error capture off. I think that's kind of our standard. Most of the time we're doing finds where the user has a chance of seeing the standard FileMaker error message, and we don't want them to see that. We want them to see a custom error message that really says accurately, your find returned, no client records or whatever, instead of FileMaker's not very helpful error message. But I think what we were going to talk about in this dev meeting was more about logging and capturing in a more comprehensive way. So I'll just throw that out there. What is everybody thinking about for this discussion?
So I think of something, John, you often say, which is when you fail early and fail loudly. And I think that's the perfect theme for what we're really talking about, which is these are often really critical errors that we're talking with. Like, otherwise you wouldn't care to capture for errors unless something critical could happen, right? If we're talking about a script where a record doesn't get updated or a record doesn't get deleted or a record doesn't get imported, or because of a various numbers of reasons, then the whole process could be completely, thrown off, right? So it can completely throw off somebody's workflow. So I feel like the whole premise here is like, fail loudly. Like, how do we make it so that it's really clear that something bad happened and we need to take a different route at this point? That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, failing silently is always bad. So proper error capture in FileMaker. Someone want to talk about best practices on capturing an error?
Error capture is tough because it's so vague, I guess, in the IDE, in FileMaker, right? When you're writing scripts, you're checking for like what errors, when do you check the error? What the standard isn't really defined. I think the most common use case scenario, John, as you were saying, is the perform find. Like, right, you're going to wrap that in error capture on and off every time. But how far do you go with that? Are you going to wrap a sort in an error capture? Are you going to wrap, omits? Like, there are just certain things that, and then that goes down the path of, well, do we make a separate script for every syntax call? Like, are we wrapping every syntax call in an error capture? Like, you can get really out of the weeds, but at the same time, I get it. Like, I kind of wish we could do that, but it's not. It's never always. Well, it's handy, never necessary, except for certain scenarios. So what's your guys' specific scenarios? I know, like, just because it's recent in memory, the insert file or insert from URL, those are two that are always wrapped in error capture. But are there any others that you guys use regularly?
You could do it before a whole bunch of set fields. Like if you're creating a new record based on an API call and you need to set a bunch of fields, obviously that might be a spot sorry, where you do it.
Yeah, I get that. So what are the main errors you're looking for there when you're setting a field? I'm trying to remember. Is it 100 if the field is missing?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're setting from a calculation, there could be errors in that calculation. Setting field by name for sure. Yeah, you're always going to wrap that in an error capture.
That's the crux of the problem, though, right there, right? Like, first of all, what could go wrong? And then if it does go wrong, what are you expecting the error is going to be that you need to account for so that you can handle it? And so that's where it gets into this, like, you can start getting into the weeds. You can be like, well, if it does this, I need to do this. And then not even account for, something you wouldn't even have thought of because you get so much in the normal. And then if you go overboard, you're like, well, we need to account for this error. We need to account for this. What if we never make it there? What if something, what if FileMaker doesn't do what FileMaker is supposed to do? And quickly, like, wait a minute, no, pull it back. Yeah. We know FileMaker is going to behave in a certain way, but it's like you start to think about the different ways that the errors can propagate, and it's easy to.
Well, there's always a like anything we do in FileMaker. It's not really FileMaker. Like anything we do as developers, there's always got to be some degree of cost benefit. Does the project warrant the level of error correction that you're doing? Is it a situation where you can get away with just showing the error to the user, or do you have to log it? What's the downside risk of being logging a little bit less or error capturing a little bit less versus a little bit more? If we're working on a project for a client that has 100 users, we're going to approach error handling a little differently than we probably would for a small 1 or 2 client situation. One thing I wanted to toss out there before, as we're talking about when is just a best practices thing. When we're doing code reviews, I think we look for this the classic set error capture on at the beginning of the script, and then never turning it off. And the badness of that approach, and just being clear that when we're talking about set error capture, we're always talking about it in a pretty, or at least when we're doing development, we're always talking about it in a real granular way. We know where we're trying to capture an error, and we know that we want to turn error capture back off right afterwards. We're never blanketly throwing a set error capture on just to suppress errors, for example. Obviously that would be bad.
Yeah. That's key, right? Like, when do you turn it on and when do you turn it off? And I think in the early days, I remember making a couple mistakes about like turning it off too early. Yeah. And then you can't actually capture it if you've turned it off, right? Like, or thinking that you're capturing, but it's only capturing on the last step, not 2 steps before where it could have failed, right? So like there's some rules in there that you really have to be aware of and think through carefully whenever you're doing error capture to see if you're going to actually what your failure might be and if you can account for it. And yeah.
And I think the other tricky part is that then after you've developed your code, you need to test it and you need it to error, right? You want it to actually throw an error so then you can test that you handled the error properly. And that can be very tricky because sometimes you can't force an error. You're like, well, yeah, I'm accounting for maybe an error could occur here, but you have to kind of create an environment to reproduce that error that may not be easy to reproduce, which we can do with the debugger, right? We can force ourselves to jump into the error capture code. And I know we're talking about FileMaker, but I think this is a really important topic with Claris Connect as well, because we're in Claris Connect, it's all automated workflow, right? So we really have to think carefully, I think, especially when developing Claris Connect, about error capture, because you're relying on this workflow that nobody could be monitoring, nobody's looking at. Suddenly an API changes and the whole thing breaks, right? And nobody can be aware of that. And so I think that's another example of where you really at least just need to capture, is this working or did it fail, right? The basic of, did something fail in this, and then alerting loudly.
I guess we haven't really started to experiment a lot with error capturing in Claris Studio yet. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves. Yeah, automated workflows, server-side scripts, those are areas where error capture is really critical. When the script is running with the user interface, you've got the fallback. Well, worst case scenario, I'm going to irritate the user, but at least they'll complain, and I'll know about the error. But in an automated situation, you don't. You really have to build in an alert system. I know we use email a fair amount, emailing error conditions and all that.
Mhm. But then do you ever consider what happens if that email fails? You know, I mean, I do think about that and then I guess this is where it comes into how mission critical is the business process that you're trying to capture, right? Like, is it so critical you want to have 2 layers of error? So you're going to send an email. If that email fails, you're going to post to Slack. You're going to do something else to try to get the message across. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point.
One kind of like testing pattern that I've, kind of used in the past with different systems was like, it'd be cool if FileMaker could handle mocking, where you basically like create like an object that is knowingly missing a few components to then test like certain cases of, like you're saying, like if an email fails, what could be done instead of this, where you could like create a sort of environment that will fail with your new system or whatever you're trying to test, and then that would be a good way to mock the object to then get that flow to happen. That's a good pattern.
One thing that's good to remind everybody, I know everybody knows this, but just to, the fact that you can change values in the data viewer, you can double click on the variable and change the value. That's a pretty handy tool for mocking up or simulating a failure condition. Does anybody ever do that?
All the time.
Oh, yeah.
That's a valuable tool.
I've also gotten in the habit of, trying to get better at it, where I put in some test variables and then they can be commented out, or they're activated if you're in a test mode, right? So then when you're trying to test, the idea would be like unit testing, right? You're trying to test for failures and you want to make sure that that it's responding correctly. So setting those variables up so that you can test them directly and you can quickly find out if they're going to work or not work and how it's going to handle it. It's similar to like manually changing them when you're in the debugger, but the debugger is tough, especially when it totally works for a lot of things, but when you're doing, traversing several script calls, it starts to get complicated because, you have to run through the first script, then it goes in the next script, and then it goes in the next script. And then, finally this one stop breakpoint is where we needed to make an adjustment. And, it's like so many lines of script steps away to get there. So to make that one critical adjustment is kind of hard.
And sometimes the data viewer gets awfully cluttered up. I know we have a few solutions that have so many variables in them. Especially if you've got an add-in written by somebody else that really heavily relies on variables, that the data viewer can get hard to work with sometimes. Be nice if it had a function that let you, I don't know how it would do this, if you could just narrow down the visible variables to the ones that are in the script you're in. But,
I was outlining some of the concepts a little bit as I was looking at doing it in one of our client projects. We've got like FileMaker errors, right, that we need to capture. Yeah, we've got script result, whether they're propagating up errors or the results that are coming up on the script that need to be captured, so you can tell if there was an error further down in the call chain. And then all of our dependent errors, right, like API call errors or other types of errors. And API errors are going to come back usually in sort of a standard flow for like a JSON response. So it's kind of helpful, but trying to come up and look at ways to handle those and keep them somewhat similar, right? So that if we handle errors in the same way that you generally handle errors with a JSON response, so that we're in that same space, then it's easily understood. You don't have like a specific way FileMaker is doing it, and then a specific way that all of the APIs handle their message and error responses. So trying to coordinate it.
You had some code we were going to maybe look at. Do you want to dive? That's sort of related to that, right? You want to dive in a little bit? While Zandon's prepping that, does anybody have any error capturing gold nuggets that we didn't hit right there? Rules of thumb or best practices on use of the set error capture command. One thing I don't think we hit real quick was just the criticality of where you call set error capture, that it really matters. You can easily lose the error message, the correct error code, if you don't have the set error capture script step in the correct location. Just a good reminder.
Yeah, that's a good one. So in this particular one, this is go to related record, which is similar to a find, and then down further we do constraints, which is basically a find on top of what we've already found. So in this instance, when I go to related record, I need to, my error capture, I've turned it on. We go through, I've got some deterministic logic that's determining, if we're in a test mode, we want to show it to the user. If not, we're going to go to a blank layout to do these tasks, sort of stuff. At this point, trying to block everything into an error handling section of code, right? So we know that we're expecting some sort of a response. We want to make sure that we're getting a zero error from FileMaker. So this is a FileMaker type of error that we might accept or get. And then we're going to determine whether or not we want to continue on, right? So how do you manage the error if you get an error? Do you want it to halt the script? Do you want it to do, we need to figure out like, how are we going to manage it? What conditional logic are we going to use based on the type of error that it is? And so in this instance where it's a find, right, I'm not going to continue if I can't get, if I get an error trying to go to related record. And then if we can continue, and I like the continue process, there's others, people might use for flagging.
I like to continue. I sometimes use the variable $go,
Go.
But yeah, I like those kind of verb-based active verb. Can I keep going? I like that kind of variable naming.
Yes, it's super clear. So in this next block, right, if we get a continue, we can continue on. If not, we've got that error and we can treat the error. But then handling the error, so even though we got the error, handling the result as the error kind of at the bottom of the script. And that's where we would normally want to do, if we're going to exit the script, we don't want to exit prematurely in the middle of the code. We want to handle all of that at the bottom, so we're not searching through a whole bunch of litany of code to find, oh, it jumped out here or it jumped out there. We want to know where it's at. So, anyway, we just, can we continue? If not, then we've set our error and our error detail. This error detail is only available for certain types of scripts. So error detail isn't always going to respond with the last error detail, but when it, I've just been putting it in because I can capture it in the custom dialog and so on and so forth. I forget which ones it's actually useful for, but it doesn't show up for the, I don't believe it shows up in the find one.
Nice to have it standardized.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to do. Exactly. So here we do another find, right? Constrain, do another set of error capture on that constraint to see, did I suddenly lose all my records, right? Am I going to get a 101 or a 401, or what's my response going to be? So I capture those, and I'm going to determine at that point, if it's 401, that's okay, but we need to handle a 401 differently. If we get no error, then we can just blindly continue. And then, so now I'm moving into the next phase. And this is where it gets a little, this is where you could start to go crazy. Like, how deep do we want to go? So yeah, and then this next section of my error handling, this is where I'm starting to determine for the result that I'm going to pass out before I end the script. If it's 401 or a 101, right, I'm going to say that I'm going to put the error code in. I'm going to say it's a success though, right? Because like in those instances, that's an okay success. No records is fine. but I don't want to do something if I get no records. And then, other ones, if we have an error and our found count, then we can say success and it's a 200. And so a 200 typically means everything's, everything's working great. And so I would pass that up as my result. And then so on and so forth, just sort of walking through the different types of problems that I might run into. And in this, if we do have an error and it's not one we've accounted for, and we're not on server, do we want to show a dialogue of that? And so there, I've got an error occurred processing the command. This is where we get that clean, it failed. We want the dialogue to show up to the user, and this can be controlled. So these are this is sort of that FileMaker error section. And then the next one has to do with the next layer up where we're going to handle errors that are coming back up the chain. So this was a top higher level parent script, right? That's calling this find transactions. And then depending on which one it calls, I'm going to take the result. So I need to get the result from those scripts that fired. And I need to take those results and figure out, what type of an error it is, because I'm going to have to, in my parent script, determine what direction I need to go or how I'm going to handle an error that was in the subscript, right? Or in the call chain. And so in this first part, this is handling whether or not we got an error at a FileMaker level, right? So we get our JSON response code 0, and we got a 200, everything's good. We capture the error because it still may be a 401, and we capture any detail if it is there. But this is where I could put a 401 would be okay, but a 200 in this sense is the only one that's going to clear. And then this is for the script specific ones, right? So if we get a successful status, but we get the 401, then I'm not going to continue with this script, and I'm going to set a result and in a JSON structure, where I've got a success, but I have an error, I get a found count, and I have a message, the script was finished successfully, so on and so forth. So at this point, it starts to, you can start sort of chasing how complicated you want to handle all of your different errors. And when you start to have multiple different, like a tree, you have multiple branches where it can fail. How do you propagate those all the way back up so that your end script, are you where does it, when it fails, does it fail? Does it fail at the branch? Does it continue all the way back up to the trunk, right? Where is it going to stop? Where is it going to, and then how are you going to handle it? When is it necessary to put full brakes on? When is it necessary to show the dialogue and allow the user to cancel out of the process, and so on and so forth? But this was just sort of it, and coming up with sort of I know we've done a bunch of different, and I've tried over the years to come up with different ones, but encompassing them into error handling process. But then you get this really verbose, this is a huge chunk of code, and all we're doing is we're performing a script, and this is to tell us whether or not it's, what our response from that script is. And, so suddenly these scripts become very verbose with error handling when the actual process, it's maybe, 10 lines of code, the error handling is occupying 90% of the script.
Yeah.
And then, you do continue. Yeah. And then I ran into this, as I'm going through this, I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Now I've said continue, right? And I'm going to do something else. But now I need to check and do a response if I get an error on that. And then, you go in and on the script that you're calling, you have all of its error checking. And so it's just sort of start stacking all of these different, I don't know, it gets in the weeds really quickly for evaluating, just a simple find to when you do get an error and how to handle it, and how to handle it in a script that has different endpoints that you might get to based on whether the error is, just something where it couldn't find a record, or the error is the layout doesn't exist kind of thing. So
I think one thing you mentioned there that I think is worth emphasizing is the desire of only having a single endpoint, a single exit point from the script, and not having exit script steps or halt script steps scattered throughout the middle of it, so that someone who's not familiar with the code has to guess where you're coming out of the script. I think, having the endpoint, the exit point of the script always being at the end is a good practice.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
definitely hugely helpful when reviewing code for sure.
Yeah, and that's a
Yeah.
whole different practice though. Like always making sure that I pass back a result. Never exiting the script isn't really like I'm not halting the script. I always want it to bubble back up realistically, right? So capturing the response and then passing that result back up, but then you do end up like there's a lot of extra thought process in this error handling in order to make this really precise. So, if this script that's three call chain down in the call chain 3 deep, will it, when it trickles up, exactly where are you going to handle it? And always making sure that it does what you want it to do.
Mm.
So,
And those continue flags that you set to allow your code to, move forward or not, or just jump to the very end and exit, like those are extremely, useful for having this sort of pattern. Or like what John was saying, the $go flag to continue or not.
yeah, and that's it. Using continue instead of a halt script, and then
Mhm.
but when you do that, then making sure that anytime you go into the script, you're going to have a result, and then you're going to need to handle that result. So it comes down to sort of like a process that you really want to adhere to. But it really complicates the code. Like this was I was working through this yesterday and testing it, and without any of this error capturing, it's like something could go wrong, but if I didn't have to account for it, I could just ignore it. And then you start adding in all this error capturing, and it's a whole nother, like the process of accomplishing the task done. The process of adding the error capturing to the process of whether or not it was done, whole nother project, right? Like, and you need it. You need that in certain situations.
Otherwise, what do you get? Otherwise, you get a solution that fails in a way that no one will ever be able to figure out.
Yeah.
And so then you have an undependable solution, and people are gonna, like that gets into a whole different world where people say, "Oh, FileMaker, it's this, that, or the other thing." Well, it's not FileMaker. It's our skills as developers. A lot of times, are we writing code that can fail silently and make the application seem buggy, or are we approaching it properly? And you wouldn't do this, right, Dan? And you wouldn't have this approach in every situation. It's situational when the complexity of what you're trying to do warrants it.
Yeah, this is intended to run as a server-side script that goes nightly, and if we get failures, we need to be logging those, because you're basically archiving records on a nightly script, and you need to have, like, if we get a failure, we need to undo whatever it is we did, and then we need to correct it. So yeah, it's kind of like with the find. It's like, well, yeah, if we get a find and we get an error, we just exit the script. But where, then that's an easy way out. But realistically, how do you know if you're having other scripts that are dependent upon that script doing what it needs to do? You want to propagate all of that messaging up the chain. And so how can you do that efficiently? Anyway, so it was fun. It was fun to do this. It was very interesting managing the errors. I also realized that you get in the weeds really quick. I don't think I'd ever done it to this level, but I had been thinking really hard about it recently. I think that the trouble that it also adds is, in this error handling process, you can make mistakes, and those mistakes are going to create bugs in the code. And so you're taking on a certain sort of responsibility in just adding the error handling, where you can create more bugs than your code would typically have, right? trying to account for this. So it's a tightrope. It's a fine line to walk and try and get it right, and then make sure that it's working. And you have to be able to test it. So anyway,
when you're completing this stuff and getting the errors, either logging the errors or alerting somebody via email or alerting somebody via dialogue, and probably you're logging no matter what, even if you are alerting somebody. I know we have our own logging add-on that we stick into any database, and anybody doing complex scripting like this is probably doing some sort of logging, and I really like our logging add-on because it lets you put a single perform script step call in there, and you don't have to worry about context. You don't have to worry about where. Just have to make that one call, and the log entry gets made, and then you're back where you started in your script. You don't have to worry about anything else. So I really like that. I really like our logging add-on. Does anybody want to show that real quick?
So yeah, here's the listing layout of the log records. So this is kind of your list view of any log events that you can log. And then so in the in your script, wherever you want to log an event, it's just really 2 lines of code. You just you build your logged parameter, which you define in a JSON object with any of your notes, any sort of detail you want, error. It'll log the script name that is that has these scripted these 2 lines, just with get script name, and then any parameter can get logged. And then these session new or end, you can define to have like a chained log listing event. So if you're having like a chain of events to log, you can set the beginning and end of the chain with these parameters. Any attachments, a deletion flag to never delete the logged item, you can flag, and then it also flags the found count. And then and then it just calls this script to log the record, log the event, which just goes through and parses out your JSON object, make sure there's none of the missing parameters, logs the event, and then then it takes you back. And then this is the listing layout here. So for instance, this was a call to clean up the deletion records, or to clean up the log records via delete. And so if you had any of those records set to be not deleted, then those would just persist. And so to call, the delete, you could just, from the gear icon, you can clean up, which would go through and clean up any records that weren't flagged to delete. And then you can click in for a more detailed view of what exactly was logged, the time, name, anything that you had tracked in that JSON object, the notes, details. And then, here it says even how many log records were deleted, any account information that you gave. Some is auto added. So like, if privilege set can be tracked, or extended privileges. And then this is the session. This is kind of going back to if you had like a chain of events happening for logging, then it would all occur here. And so like for this one, for example, this was an example of a start process to an end process. So these are chained in a way and then flagged as a start and stop. And so here you can see that these 3 records were chained together in this one session. And then if it was an error that had occurred that was being logged, and it was flagged as an error, then it would, signify as red in your listing. And then with the little caution icon here, signifying this was an error, in this case, just a dummy error for the testing and the example logs. And and also these, if if you do add this solution or this add-on to a solution, all these named kind of parameters are connected to go view in the Claris documentation. So if you want to learn more about, extended privilege, you can pull it up in a web viewer and go to the Claris help page for that specific header.
I didn't even know it did that.
Oh yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. So yeah, if you ever, don't know what network protocol means for FileMaker or whatever, you can pull it up here. You can learn about the parameters, data type, format, and then some related example and related topics. And so, yeah, this was definitely, we use this pretty heavily, definitely at Portage Bay to log our events. It's kind of a standard nowadays, it seems, for us to use. I know I use it in most of my, newer solutions, and like email steps or any other add-ons. I usually integrate with the logging add-on with it to log more details.
Has
Yeah.
anybody, I'm just curious, has anybody ever gotten into a solution they're working on, trying to troubleshoot something and complained that the developer put in too much logging? How about the opposite? Have you ever cursed the previous developer because there wasn't enough logging? I don't think you'd be hard pressed to over log.
I've definitely never thought there's too much.
Especially if it's server side, stuff where you can't, you have less visibility into what's going on, or if it's something that's happening in FileMaker Go, where you don't have a lot of visibility into what's happening in a server side script or in FileMaker Go, and so having that extra logging to be able to see, well, where did it break? How far did it get? That can be, especially, well, I mean, it goes without saying that during development, sometimes I've had occasions during development or during troubleshooting something where I'm sticking the logging script step in almost literally after every line of code, trying to figure out where something's happening in a server-side script or a FileMaker Go situation. Shannon, are you using the logging add-on in that code you were showing us earlier?
No, I have not added it into that client solution. I did end up using the ultra log in there. Super helpful.
Oh yeah, we were going to talk a little bit about audit logging. We use Nightwing's ultra log for some of our audit logging. I know some of the newer techniques for doing audit logging involve the newer transaction handling, or we're often using that old custom function, using that to log data changes. Russell, you were just implementing that in a couple of solutions.
Yeah, the audit archive.
Yeah, that can be a super helpful in error tracking and troubleshooting when you have a history of the data changes that were made to a record.
Yeah, and even with the audit archive, I'm even adding logging to it. So with the conversation of even logging just an event, not necessarily like an error, but just logging things happening. This is just the add-on itself, so it's just a comment here. But after the parameter, creating the parameter and then adding the call to that logging add-on here for start, logging no fields, any sort of, pretty much any and all cases happening, I usually try to log that event. And then so when you view it in your logging add-on listing, you can see, a block of logs that say the process started, process happened with this many events logged, and then the process ended, successfully, or whatever your success case could be.
I was just going to say, anybody else have any comments on data change logging, audit logging?
Well, the only thing you'd said is there ever too much logging, and that's the only caveat is being aware of when you're logging and doing it in a good space, right? Like if you're managing a whole lot of tight loops and you've got a lot of stuff happening in the loop, you can have huge impacts by unnecessarily creating logs.
Yeah, looping with logs, that's a slippery slope for sure.
Yeah, I think
that's
both.
the only thing I was going to say earlier, because I had added those in for basically for a Shopify integration where I'm doing a lot of curl calls back and forth with Shopify. And it's important to be able to log all of those, but at the same time, you've got so many calls that are happening. You've got a couple of thousand of them. So in a single session, that's going to normally take several minutes to run anyway. When you add on top of that, if you do 3 or 4 logs per call, in addition to each, it's suddenly like it expanded the amount of time that it needed to run, and so I had to really dial that back.
Yeah, my facetious question is obviously sometimes the answer is yes, there is too much logging. I guess often we have no logging at all, so I was being a little disingenuous there that it's certainly possible to go too far, and with the data logging changes too, I know we took over a solution once from a previous developer who was using a text field to log. They had their own funky data change archiving function where when a user changed a field, their script would copy the change to a text field and append it to the text field. So there was sort of an ongoing kind of notes pending sort of change history thing going on. And then we were trying to more comprehensively do some audit log tracking. The solution didn't do it at a field level. It was just only what the previous developer had wanted to log was logged. And we went in and implemented a more comprehensive audit logging function. But the two didn't mix well. And that was definitely a case where being aware of for example, what that audit logging function does, which is, it captures the previous value in the field and the new value in the field and who made the change and when. Super helpful information, but problematic if the field is a text object that can contain a lot of data. So in that case, what we were logging was let's just say for the sake of argument, we were logging a 2,000 character text field. And then we were logging the new 2010 character text field. And every time a user did a particular action, that was being repeated. And pretty soon the data file was we all know FileMaker is not always the most efficient at text field, text manipulation operations. So pretty soon the appending of the text in that audit log field was becoming a noticeable performance problem, and we had to go in and track down why was the database suddenly slower than it used to be. Well, it was the intrusiveness of that audit logging function, and easy fix. We just went in and removed that one field. We didn't need to be tracking changes to that field, and so we just removed it, and it removed the performance problem. But good example of yes, sometimes you can log a little too much. But at the same time, the number of times I've found that audit logging helpful, I mean, obviously it's necessary sometimes. Sometimes it's a requirement. You have to be able to log the changes to fields as a requirement of the project. But as developers, it can be really handy. The situation I've always liked it in is when the user complains of a bug or something, and you're like super sure that there's no bug and that it's something the user's doing. And then you go into the audit log history to prove it to them, only to realize that what you've just proved that there's a bug. and it can really, I've always found it helpful in helping make clear whether or not is there a bug in the database and the data is changing because of the bug, or is it possible that the end user doesn't understand something and it's something that they're doing. And it can really help tremendously in narrowing down where the error is occurring, whether it's scripting or an end user doing something. And it can really help protect you against accusing the end user of doing something when in fact it's your own bug.
Mm-hmm.
Well, cool. Thanks, Russell, for showing the audit logging stuff
Yeah.
a bit. I guess that's a good point to close things out for today. Good discussion on errors and capturing and logging. So thanks, everyone.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you for spending your time with us at the FileMaker Dev Cast today. We hope you found something useful, something thought-provoking, and something to take into your own development approach. Things that help you to be more productive and to allow you and your team to get more done in less time. Find us online at portagebay.com and filemakerdevcast.com, and also on social media at FM DevCast and Portage Bay. Let us know if we can help you or your company with modernizing your approaches and streamlining your workflow. We look forward to seeing you at the next DevCast.